Namaskar and welcome to NatStrat Conversations. My name is Pankaj Saran and I welcome you to another episode of Conversations where we bring you geopolitics, technology, security, and much more. Today we have a guest who has traveled a long distance, who's currently in India. We managed to grab him and not easy to get him, but a well-known name, well-known figure, also controversial. But that adds to our fun and to our discussion. James Crabtree is a geopolitical analyst and an author with extensive experience in Asia. He currently lives in London and has written a book on India, The Billionaire Raj, 8 years ago. He has done everything that you can think of in terms of writing, in terms of think tanking. He's currently at the European Council for Foreign Affairs in Berlin and has written for all the major newspapers, the Financial Times, New York Times, The Guardian. He was the Financial Times correspondent in Mumbai for 5 years, and he knows India as well as anyone would. So it's a great pleasure, James, to have you on NatStrat. Thank you so much for taking time out.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's great to be here.
And to get you over while you're in Delhi. And welcome. What brings you to Delhi? Is there anything you can tell us about? Is it one of your regular trips to India?
Well, so this week we're speaking on Republic Day, and you have a group of Europeans here. So President von der Leyen and her group are here in Delhi. And so it just so happened that I was able to come this week with a delegation of experts and me. I tagged along for discussions about the future of Europe and India to coincide with the big push by Europe and India to rebuild and recreate this geopolitical relationship. So very happy to be here.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it's a big development, big breakthrough in the relationship, and I mean, all eyes are actually on both India and Europe. But before we come to that, what I thought I'd ask you to do is to begin with Europe, talk a little bit about what's happening in Europe, how, and if you can share with us what's the mood, what's the sentiment in Europe about where Europe stands today, the internal contradictions, and also then tell us a little bit about the United States, what you see is going on there, the domestic politics, also the Europe-US relationship. Then obviously we have to talk a little bit about Russia, and if there's anything you can tell us about what's going on in China recently. And maybe then we can round it up with what you talked about, the India-Europe, and how you see India from Europe. I mean, how do you see India as an economy, as a political actor on the stage? And where do you see India headed in terms of not just India-Europe, but also broadly speaking, India's profile and actions on the global stage. So maybe to begin with, we begin from Europe, and Europe is actually in the center of everyone's attention. What's going on in Europe? How does Europe look at the changes going on between itself and the United States, but also within Europe? I mean, what's going on? I mean, for an Indian audience or even for an international audience, I mean, sitting there in the heart of Europe, could you, I mean, in a few minutes, it's not easy, but whatever you can share.
Well, no, as I said, delighted to be here, and congratulations, Ambassador, for all that you've done with NatStrat. It's a great new entrant into and a sort of essential reading for those of us trying to understand the region. I was in Brussels 2 weeks ago to meet some senior figures from the European Commission in advance of the meeting. And I mean, the mood in Brussels is pretty bleak. So if you look in all major directions, you have enormous problems. So to the east, you have Russia and the war in Ukraine, which is going badly. I mean, not horrendously badly, but pretty badly. To the far east, you have China, which is threatening to ruin your economic model with excessively cheap imports and is helping Russians in Ukraine. And then to the west, you have the Americans, which, in a way that's even more severe than here in India, your longest term anchor geopolitical relationship has gone completely off the reservation. And Europe in particular, in a sense, there are a lot of US partners and allies who are caught in a bind because of Trump. It's true for India as a close partner. It's true for Japan, Korea. Everyone's struggling. But the Europeans have a particular problem, which is that they can't push back against the Americans on anything, or at least they have to be very careful about doing that, on Greenland, on big tech, because the fear is that if we do that, then Zelensky gets it in the neck. As in, the way that the Americans will exert leverage is by punishing the Ukrainians, and Ukraine is such a strategic priority that it means you're caught between two sides. So many things in Europe are problematic. Within the context of that, India is a bright spot. In the same way that India is trying to diversify its geopolitical relationships, to double down on multi-alignment, because its relationship with America, the cornerstone of its strategic direction for the last 2 decades, is now much more problematic. Europe is doing exactly the same. And so if you look at where President von der Leyen in Brussels has recently been, well, we've had a big push with Latin America, trying to do a trade deal, the Middle East. But really, India is the biggest play. India is the biggest potential new area. And so that's why what's happening today and tomorrow in Delhi matters so much, because for a geopolitical Europe that is now trying to find a new way to be in the world, now that what we used to call the international rules-based order is no more in the way that Mark Carney discussed at Davos. And therefore, as we seek new partners, then India is the biggest, the one where there is most opportunity for growth, to try and do something really different that will, in a sense, give Europe a stronger set of partnerships to compensate for what we've lost with the Americans, at least for now.
No, great. That's a fantastic overview. But when you talk of Europe, I mean, the sense I get is that there's so many divisions within Europe about the future of Europe, about the position towards the Ukraine war, about the attitude to the United States, and the whole European project itself seems to be under some kind of stress. And this whole talk about the coalition of the willing and differences within the sub-regions of Europe, is that, are we reading too much into that, or is that something which you...
No, I mean, I think it's undeniably true that in a new world of great power competition, it is very helpful to have unitary authority. So that means that China, Russia, India, the United States have an advantage over Europe and Southeast Asia, because Europe and ASEAN, their strength in the world comes from their size in total, but internally they're very divided, and therefore they move quite slowly. And so that is a strategic disadvantage. In a Hobbesian world of a war of all against all, it helps to have a Leviathan. And Europe isn't really a Leviathan. It's sort of more of a confederation. That said, in a sense, when your back is against the wall, then you can begin to do things you didn't think were possible. And that's true, for India in terms of what it's being forced to do, but it's also true for us. And therefore, if you take a practical example, tomorrow, we think there will be a political agreement on a Europe-India free trade agreement announced. Now, the idea that Europe could negotiate with anyone a free trade agreement in 9 months, I mean, nobody could have possibly believed this. It's taken us 20 years to negotiate an agreement with the Latin Americans. And yet geopolitics has a way of forcing the mind to focus on what needs to be done. And so Ursula von der Leyen and Prime Minister Modi sat down about a year ago and said, okay, we've got to do this for geopolitical reasons. And they looked very hard at their respective teams and said, go and get this done. And on the European side, you have DG Trade, and on the Indian side, you have Piyush Goyal, two masterful negotiators who, left to their own devices, would probably have taken another 20 years to get this done. And the political leaders said, we need this now. And so that's why we're going to do it. So it is definitely true that Europe suffers from challenges of internal division, and it is consensus-based, and that is a problem. But it doesn't mean that you can't get things done when you need to. And I think that's what India has seen, is that Europe is in a position where it really needs to move forward on some of these areas, and therefore it's not everything that could be achieved, and there will be challenges on the road ahead. But for those of us who were looking at this 2 years ago, I think there's been a lot of progress. And it's very impressive compared to what one might have reasonably expected.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I noticed that you're kind of linking the European challenges today with the pivot to India, if one can use that word. And that's very interesting because I think we both, in our own ways, are facing challenges with respect to our principal strategic, in your case, ally, in our case, partner, which is the United States. So, yeah, so I agree with you, by the way, on the relationship between India and Europe. And I think it's never been better for the reasons you described. And I think really we are coming at this relationship at a time not when Europe is strong, but in a sense when Europe itself is kind of searching for solutions within. So that's a little interesting.
But I suppose I would put it the other way. It is true that Europe has challenges, but if you look at what India is trying to do with Europe, there's a cold logic to it, which is if you look around the world, what do you get from the Americans that you really want? So investment, technology, defense expertise, they're probably the three most important pillars. And you look around the world and you think, well, who else can you get that from? Well, you can get bits of it from Russia, but it's not reliable. You can get some of it from China, but then there are lots of strings attached. So actually, Europe has a lot of these things. It's a rich area. It has defense and innovation, not to the same level as the Americans, but a reasonable amount. It has technology, not to the same level of the Americans, but a reasonable amount. So Europe has a lot to offer, and I think it's almost been Europe has had to work out how to sell itself in two respects. One of which is that in a world in which everyone is diversifying, Europe looks quite economically attractive because it has a lot of money to invest, particularly now Europe is going to invest less in China. But the other thing, and I think my message to the Europeans has been, is that Europe is a very changed security actor. For a long time, Europe has been seen as this rather peculiar multilateral trading body. But the Europe that has been on the front lines in Ukraine, that is investing huge amounts of money in its own defense, that is rearming, that's a very different and much more credible strategic partner. And to be honest, in this part of the world, what really matters is the strategic element of the partnership. And a Europe that can offer more on defense and security, on cyber, on space, in addition to free trade. Now, that's a much more attractive partner. It's maybe not as attractive as the United States. But I think, there's a reason why Mr. Modi and Mr. Jaishankar are putting more eggs in the European basket. And it's not because, they like coming to Paris and London and Berlin. It's because they see things in Europe that are useful to India that don't come with as many strings attached as you'd get from Russia or China.
Well, there used to be strings attached in the Europe relationship of the past, where you would get lectures on human rights.
So Tom, there's a German thinker who had a nice phrase about this, which is that Europe used to be what he described as strategically obnoxious, as in, you get lots of lectures about human rights and Kashmir and media freedom, and India used to very much dislike this, particularly when it came from colonial, sort of imperialist powers like my own country. I think the Europeans now have stopped doing that almost because they have bigger fish to fry. They recognize that we're in a much more kind of urgent period in which you need friends and you can't afford to be too judgmental about your friends and their internal politics. So in a sense, as India has become more global, Europe has become more like India in its willingness to respect other people's internal governance and not be so preachy. And I think that makes the partnership easier. There are still challenges. I mean, you identified Europe's internal problems. You have issues like, environmental laws, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which India very much doesn't like. There are steel rules they don't like. So there are still plenty of challenges ahead. But I still think a lot of progress has been made, and therefore both on the European and the Indian side, in a sense, the downside of everything that Mr. Trump has done is that he has brought together this marriage, which probably wouldn't have happened without him.
So I'm not sure whether I should move from your comments to discussions on the United States or China, but maybe I'll start with China because you talked about the new dimension of the European personality, which is more strategic, at least for India. So on China, I mean, if you were to move to China, how much of a help can Europe be in terms of the Indo-Pacific region as a credible strategic or a security actor from an Indian point of view? Do you see that also changing in terms of Europe's own posture in the region, in the Indo-Pacific
I think you've always had this tension in the Europe-India relationship, which is, if I were to put it very crudely, Europe cares very much about Russia and sees it as a huge security threat and would like a stable relationship with China. And India is the other way around. It cares very much about China, sees it as a big security threat, both in the Himalayas and in the region, in the neighborhood and in the Indian Ocean. And it wants a stable relationship with Russia. And so that's a kind of tension that the threat perception is quite different when viewed from, Berlin, Brussels, Paris, and Delhi. I mean, I don't think it's realistic to think that Europe is going to be a major security player in East Asia, for instance. The crux of this is about Taiwan and the relationship between the Chinese and the Americans. I think Europe does have aspirations to do more in the Indian Ocean as a partner, and you'll see tomorrow Europe and India will sign a defense and security partnership, which is only the third of these new security partnerships that Europe has signed. One with the Japanese, one with the Koreans, and now one with India. And I think, these are, they're not gigantic breakthroughs, but there are some good opportunities for partnership in areas like cyber, maritime security. You also have some genuinely big industrial deals. So this submarine deal that is going to come out with Germany, I mean, that's 8 billion. That's one of the largest defense procurement deals in Indian history to buy these German submarines. So if you tot up, German submarines, French jets, there's quite a lot going on the kind of India-Europe file. And I think, the European countries are in a funny position with China. The European Commission of von der Leyen is quite radicalized by China because they, more than anyone, see the economic threat and they see the strategic threat in Ukraine. Germany. Well, so to take a big picture, I mean, that strat is a big picture place. So in two different respects, China is really attempting to change the security and economic order in Europe. In the security sphere, they're propping up the Russian war effort. It's perfectly clear that without China's help, Russia would have not been able to prosecute the war in the same way. So in that sense, China is having a dramatic, if indirect, effect on the European security order. They're also having a huge effect on the European economic order because of the nature of their economic model and the move into high-value manufacturing exports, which directly threatens the core of Europe's prosperity in a way that is partially unfair because of subsidies, but also partially just because of Chinese innovation and huge scale. And so in both of these respects, Europe is struggling to work out what to do. The European Commission is the most hawkish voice, and they are thinking quite radically about what you do to try and protect the European economic model and also what to do about Ukraine. Some of the national capitals are in a slightly different place, London, Berlin, France, in their own way, as is India, interestingly, in the post-Trump moment, are trying to repair and slightly improve, albeit not dramatically improve. So in that sense, Delhi and the European national capitals are in a similar position of very tentatively trying to work out, can we do a little bit more with China within the boundaries of good sense on long-term security? And I think Delhi is trying to do that. And I think, Keir Starmer is about to go to China. Macron is trying to talk to China because he's doing the G7 presidency. Merz is also going to China. So there's a bit more active diplomacy going on between European capitals and India with China. And I think that's also, in some sense, a function of the Trump moment and the kind of rebalancing around the world that Trump has caused.
Very good. But on China, I mean, since we are on China, and I know you're not a China specialist, but you have served in Singapore and you know the region really well and so on. Is there anything you can share, your impressions about, is China in good shape? I mean, we've had these incredible, the vice chair of the Central Military Commission and top generals. This is right next to Xi himself. So it's too close to the top.
I mean, to be honest, it's a little bit like, as a foreigner living in India, I always used to say to people that after 5 years living in India, I was much better informed, but much more confused than I was at the beginning. And, China it's very complicated and difficult to understand, even if you do have the language. I think let's point at the kind of contradiction, right? So Bonnie Glaser, who is at the German Marshall Fund and is probably the doyenne of American China scholars, she had a meeting in London recently that I hosted, and she said that in her entire career, I don't know, 30, 35 years, she'd never seen Chinese interlocutors more confident. And so that's partly a kind of long-term civilizational confidence. The East is rising, the West is declining. It's partly looking at Trump making a gigantic mess of all the things that China fears, the US alliance system, the transatlantic, all the things in the American system that Beijing wanted to damage. Trump is damaging them all. So they see that. And in particular, China quite rightly feels like it had a great 2025. So India did not have a good 2025. Europe didn't have a good 2025, but China did have a pretty good 2025, as in the Americans whacked them with tariffs. Right. China fought back with rare earths. They stood their ground, and then they negotiated a ceasefire on roughly equal terms, which is very different from what happened in the first Trump administration. Right. China, over the last decade has gone through a very serious process of trying to de-risk from America and the West, in anticipation that at some point the West was going to come and try and whack them over the head. And Trump came and tried to whack them over the head and discovered that actually they're not as weak as they once were, and they can kind of, And so in that sense, China is very self-confident. Now you have the contradiction to this, which is what you're referring to is yesterday there was this extraordinary story in the Wall Street Journal giving details on the purge that has happened with one of the vice chairs of the Central Military Commission. Now, for those of your listeners who aren't familiar with the Chinese system, the defense minister of China is not really in most countries, in India and in most European countries, the defense minister is one of the 4 or 5 most important people in politics. In China, the defense minister wouldn't even make it onto the list of the top 50 most important people. But they have this body called the Central Military Commission, which is chaired by President Xi and normally has somewhere between 5 to 7 generals on it from the People's Liberation Army. And they're the people who really make the decisions of should we have a war with India? Should we invade Taiwan? It's the central decision-making body. And Xi has now purged all but one of its members, including the most senior remaining of the vice chairs. And so we don't know what's happened. It's difficult to say, but I think what you can say is this would not be happening if all was well. And so partially it could be about readiness. President Xi is unhappy that he set a 2027 target to get the military ready, potentially, if he wanted them to be able to launch an amphibious invasion in Taiwan, and progress to that in various respects has been patchy, it seems. But there also simply seems to be a power struggle going on. There are all sorts of stories flying around of questionable provenance about, coup attempts, and most of these are probably untrue, but it's pretty clear that he wouldn't be doing this if he was feeling confident about his own position with respect to the military. And therefore you have this contradiction in which China, on the one hand, is feeling very confident about its place in the world. And this is true after things like Venezuela and Greenland. China is building a set of alternative institutions, the Shanghai Cooperation, and the BRICS. On the other hand, in Beijing, clearly there's a lot of internal machinations that are hard for us to understand, but indicate turmoil within the system in a way that is difficult to read, but obviously challenging for Beijing. So I think, it's obviously a very dynamic period in China.
Yeah, it's amazing that you have this somewhat dichotomous situation where externally, as I agree with you, they think they are on a good wicket, but internally we see all of this stuff happening. But let me just also shift a little bit to the United States and China. To begin with, what's your sense of how the Chinese would have reacted or have reacted to both the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, or more generally speaking, the Trumpian approach to China? Is that something which you did touch upon it, but from a more security, strategic, global balance point of view?
It's such an interesting question because you have sort of 3 different ways you might look at this. You have what is presently going on with the US-China bilateral. Then you have what's written out on paper in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, which came out 48 hours ago. And then you have what Trump is actually doing. So let's take each of them in turn. The bilateral looks pretty good, and very good, in fact, from Beijing's point of view. You have a meeting that is scheduled, not yet scheduled, but is likely to take place at some point in the spring, between a state visit with a trade deal. And then 3 further potential bilateral meetings. So at the G20, the ASEAN APEC meetings in the autumn in Asia, and then another reciprocal state visit in which President Xi.
Correct.
And so those have a very stabilizing effect. What does China want? Basically, I think China wants stability on the US-China file because it's confident in the long term. It feels like as long as things are stable, China will continue to de-risk, its power will grow, its military modernization will continue. And there will come a point in 10 years' time in which the Americans realize that actually China is stronger now. So they want stability. And they're on, for the next 12 to 18 months, they have a pathway to a stable relationship, as you will know as an ambassador and a policymaker, these processes mean that the Americans are much less willing to do competitive and coercive things to the Chinese because they want the state visit to go well. At a very basic level, what does Trump want? Trump wants to go to Beijing and he wants to have the same kind of visit that he had in Saudi Arabia. He wants to bring a lot of chief executives, lots of ceremonies. He wants to be treated like a visiting king, and he wants to unveil a whole bunch of deals, some of which will be real, some of which will be made up. And that's what he wants. And therefore, the people around him know that you shouldn't disrupt that. And that's good for China. So on that file 1, things are looking very good. File 2 looks much less good, as in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, particularly the national defense strategy, were very conventional from a kind of Biden era perspective. They're very focused on China supporting Taiwan. They had the air of, there's a senior official that a lot of us look to, people like me and you, called Elbridge Colby, who is a very prominent advocate for a much more hawkish approach on Taiwan, the denial defense. So all of that is there in the national defense strategy. But the question is, is that worth the paper it's written on? As in, they might have this on paper, but is this what they're actually going to do? And that then takes you to, Venezuela, Greenland, all of the, the kind of wild roller coaster ride of what Trump is actually doing in practice, bombing the Iranians this day. And that, I think, is all broadly pretty good for China as well. Some of it comes with rough edges. So if you take Venezuela, China won't have been wild about that happening, as in the Venezuelan oil was useful to them, and the sight of a partner of China being led off in handcuffs to a plane is not something that will have been welcome to Beijing. But in a sense, every time the United States, in a long-term sense, takes an action which, knocks another block out of the Jenga pile of the rules-based order, then it makes it easier for China eventually to either take it over or push it over, whichever they decide to do. And so China is both seeking much greater influence within the existing international institutions, the UN system. It's also building its own institutions. And in a sense, the more the Americans go around breaking their own system, the easier it is for China to kind of lead within that system, what remains of it, and to build institutions of their own, and to make that argument principally to the global south, but also, to India and the Europeans, and say, well, look, the Americans have gone rogue, so maybe you could do a bit more with us. And so I think that's strategically positive for China, even if it presents some short-term challenges.
Great, wonderful. So now can we turn to the United States and America? And how do you think we should read what's happening in the United States, within the country, and the whole, what's going on, and where are we going, and where are we headed?
I think there's a real dilemma which almost all world leaders face, but not so much actually the allies and partners, right? Which is, we know in theory that what works is to stand up to Trump. That's what the Chinese did. He respects strength. The way to negotiate him is to hit back hard. He's absolutely obsessed with escalation dominance, meaning the ability to kind of, to put it very crudely, if someone punches him in the face, he punches back 3 times harder. And so it's very tricky, because if you go too softly, people will say, well, you're not standing up to him, and therefore he'll just take anything you offer. But then if you do what Mark Carney did at Davos, and you stand up and you punch back, then you get 100% tariffs. And people say, well, that was a silly thing to do. Why didn't you, play a more discreet, softer game? And so everyone is stuck with this problem. The Europeans are stuck. To some degree, India is also stuck. India at the moment is not punching back. I mean, if you think of the long heritage of India's relationship with the United States. There was an era when Mrs. Gandhi would have just sort of told these guys to go jump in a lake. But India can't do that now. The trade, the technology, military links are too important. So India is also having to play this kind of careful game of trying to calibrate a response which is firm and which respects red lines, but is not needlessly provocative, given the reaction function in Washington is very, very difficult to gauge. I mean, one way to think about this, Trump is often compared to a mafia boss, but there's been this line of analysis to think of him instead as a king. And this, the basic dynamic that you often saw, you see it in mafia movies, you see it in kind of, I don't know, Tudor England, is that the king will be very tough on his barons, the people who are within his system, because he has to get them to do things for him, protect the kingdom, extract money. But he's much more respectful towards adversaries, the heads of fellow crime families or fellow monarchs, because they're his equals, and he has to treat them with respect in order to avoid conflict. And there's sort of something like that going on at a high level. And it's difficult for American allies and partners to deal with this because it feels very unfair, as in the countries that are nicest to America get treated worst. And the ones that are most challenging get treated best. And in a sense, I think everyone in Delhi and in London, in Brussels, in Berlin, everybody's trying to work out how you manage this new dynamic, given the way that Trump behaves is so different from the way that America has behaved historically.
No, but James, I mean, the question is it something which is unique or individual to him, or is there something deeper happening within American society which has thrown up someone like him? I mean, are we going to see this? Is it something which is going to live beyond him?
I think it's both of these things. So he is clearly a very sui generis figure. He behaves in a particular way. If there were to be another Trumpian figure, then I doubt that they would, he has these very deep grooves in his personality, trade, anti-immigration, distrust of allies. I don't think it's necessary that whoever follows him will have the same approach to negotiation that he does. But it is very clear that, there is a much deeper change happening in the United States, which is, fundamentally, the United States has been a global hyperpower since 1945. And that comes with certain costs, as in the United States has a calculus, which is it invests in global goods for which everybody benefits. But ultimately, the United States as a whole benefits from having this system. And therefore, it's worth them, in a sense, paying the cost of these global public goods, because net in the long term, it builds the kind of world that is suitable for American interests. Yeah. Specifically within the Indian system, the Americans used to say this is, they used to talk about strategic altruism. Correct. And so at a very basic level, that this theory said, we will behave in a way that is strategically altruistic towards India, because anything that is good for India is basically good for us. As in, we look at China rising, our long-term rival, and if there is a triangular Asia in which you have a strong China, but also a strong India, that's easier for us to manage. As in, it's easier for us to manage the Chinese if the Indians are strong. Therefore, pretty much whatever we can do to help India, we will do. And Trump's view is that is completely insane. As in, we're giving much too much away for India and we're not getting anything in return. And there is a credible argument to be made. You'd hear people on Capitol Hill, even under Biden, saying, we're giving a lot to the Indians. What are we getting in return? Not much. Maybe we should get a better deal. And Trump is just taking this to the nth degree. I mean, I think, and I think many in the strategic community think that this is an enormous strategic blunder by the United States, that really the greatest achievement of American statecraft in the last 20 years was building a stronger relationship with India fit to create an Asia that might be able to balance China in the long term. I mean, in a sense, whether you're Kurt Campbell or, it was a real success a bipartisan success of American statecraft over 20 years to give India sufficient incentives to become closer to the West, not an ally, strategically autonomous, but much friendlier to the West, with an eye on a rising China. And Trump is throwing that all away for nothing. And so in that sense, it's a strategic disaster, really. But behind that is this question of behaving in a way that is sort of strategically altruistic. And Trump just doesn't believe that. He thinks in a short-term sense, he can get a lot more out of India and other countries by being tougher. And to some degree, in the short term, he's probably right about that. As in, he is going to get these deals that are beneficial to America in the short term. But the cost in terms of the degradation of the American-led system in the medium to long term is going to be very high.
Yeah. So that's well put, because the question here in India is whether this is something which we live with for the next 3 years, or is it a structural shift?
Henry Kissinger had, before he died, he did an interview with the Financial Times, the Lunch with the FT slot, and he had a very nice line about Trump, where he said sometimes in the course of history, figures appear whose job, whether they are aware of it or not, is to reveal the pretensions of the previous era and to usher in the new, words to that effect. And so what he was saying was that Trump, to some degree, is a handmaiden of historical forces that he simply doesn't understand. And the willingness of the American public to pay, either in blood or treasure, to uphold a world order, to invest in public goods, to make sure the Straits of Hormuz stay open, or to police the Taiwan Straits, or to keep the trade lanes open. America's willingness to do that is simply diminishing. And in a sense, this is, it's a story that would be familiar from, Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which is America is suffering from a form of imperial overstretch. It has been probably the greatest hyperpower in the history of the world. It has bestrides the world, and its ability to sustain that is now under question. And the question is, well, what does America do? There is a strain of thought which says, we can continue to be the dominant power. What we've got to do is draw back in Europe and the Middle East and focus on Asia. That's a coherent sort of point of view. But the question is, are they actually going to be able to do that in practice? Because drawing down is extremely difficult.
Yeah, excellent. Fantastic. Your historical allusion to Trump and looking at him in the historical perspective, reminds me so much of Mikhail Gorbachev. I was in Moscow in 1985 when, he was 52. He kind of jumped the queue and became the general secretary. And then, of course, what happened to the country in 6 years. So the emergence of a historical figure who wants to challenge the status quo is also something which has a certain amount of resonance to it. But finally, India. You wrote this book, very critical, on the billionaire Raj, 2018. That was 8 years ago. Things have changed in 8 years. I suppose they have. I want to ask you. That's one aspect of the question. The second is, so we've discussed a little bit in the course of the conversation, but more focused on India. How do you see the India of today? How do you see the trajectory on which India is? And what do you think India should be doing in the future? Or what do you expect? A lot of questions. What do you expect India to do? You've written so much. You've spoken so much about India. Have you got it right? Have you read it right? So your thoughts, on these complex set of questions.
Well, so I'm going to contest your idea that my book was critical of India. Actually, my book was very optimistic about India's future. It was reviewed in the New York Times, and there was a line in the review that I always remember, because the author said, Mr. Crabtree claims his book is very optimistic about India's future, but if you read the book, there isn't very much to be optimistic about. And that's because the book was about a story fundamentally in the kind of UPA 2 years, when you had the season of scams, a period in which India had a lot of corruption challenges leading into the Modi years. And so the book was about the rise of the Indian billionaire class and the crony capitalism that came with it. And yes, so in that sense, I understand why you said it was critical, because I wrote a lot about, some pretty bad things that happened in the country. But the meta argument that I was making was that actually that's quite normal. The subtitle of the book was A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age. And the point was that Britain in the 1820s, America in the 1880s after the Civil War, South Korea in the 1960s, China in the 2000s, every country of import that matters goes through a period of rapid industrialization, and crony capitalism and rising inequality tends to come with it. So in that sense, India is no different. There's nothing sui generis about India's position. People in India, particularly in UPA 2, the period of the latter Manmohan Singh years were very self-critical. You would hear this phrase, we are like this only, which was to say there's something uniquely flawed in the Indian character that makes us susceptible to crony capitalism. And the optimism in my book was to say, no, that's true of the British in the Dickensian years, or the Gilded Age Americans, or South Korea in the autocrats, or even Singapore in the 1950s had terrible corruption. Development is a very positive force because you build better institutions and you change your economy and you can get rid of a lot of these challenges. The question is, how do you do it and how quickly? How quickly do you move beyond these Gilded Age years and hopefully build a country that is more advanced but also more equal, kinder, gentler. So in that sense, I think my book was optimistic, but I do think that the book holds up reasonably well, as in the nature of Indian sort of crony capitalism has changed a lot under Prime Minister Modi. The big scams have stopped, but there's still problems there in terms of concentrated corporate power and the relationship between the corporate sector and the state, which I think will require reform on an ongoing basis, as has been true in other countries. I mean, in terms of India's geopolitical position, I was having this debate with someone the other day. I'd be interested in your view, but if the pub quiz question is 2025 was the worst year for Indian foreign policy since X, what is X? I mean, it seems to me that it was probably the worst year of foreign policy in the Modi era because you had this big strategic setback. It was worse than 2020 when you had the border conflict. So worst year since Kargil, worst year since 1984, worst year since 1962. I don't know what the answer is, but it clearly was a bad year because India had this strategic, it had a strategy, and the strategy was draw closer principally to the Americans, but also the West and the democratic Asian countries in the Middle East. But America was the cornerstone. And so the cornerstone of the strategy has gone wrong in the same way that it has for the Europeans. And so now that was a big setback. And the question is, how do you pick yourself up after this setback and set off on a new path? That having been said, I mean, I would be I'm optimistic about India's long-term future. India, as was true as we talked about at the beginning with the Europeans, India is a very attractive partner for anyone who's seeking to diversify. It is the biggest country that is rising and will rise. And it's perfectly clear, I think, to everyone that the world of 2050 will be more Indian. It will be more influenced by India. India will play a bigger institutional role. India will be a bigger economic player and a bigger military player. And I think the question now is, if I were being a critical friend of India, I would say that the successes of the last 10 or 20 years led to a moment in which India was a touch overconfident about its place in the world, and the last year has been maybe a useful corrective of recognizing that not just on the America file, but Pakistan too. I mean, Operation Sindoor was the other big challenge of the recent history. And I think so India, in a sense, is going to take a step back and work out what it needs to do to strengthen its own foundations in terms of its geopolitical relationships, in terms of its military strength with respect to Pakistan. And in the end, India will probably emerge stronger for this process. But I think the question now is, given the setbacks of last year in terms of the United States, in terms of Operation Sindoor and in other areas, then what now is the new strategy, the repurposed, reinvigorated multi-alignment? And how do you manage the many challenges that come with a world that is simply, more chaotic, more Trumpian than the one that was true for most of the Modi years?
Great. The whole question of strategic autonomy is something which probably is more familiar today to the Europeans than before. So in that sense, the Indian approach to, if you call it multi-alignment or multipolar order and so on, and just having autonomous, independent decision-making probably has greater resonance today in Europe than elsewhere. But in overall terms, anything which you see India should be doing better? Or, 2026, we've just entered into 2026. I think the reality check out of the Trump shock is a positive thing for India, I think. But how do you see what India should be doing?
I mean, I think it's fairly simple, right? The kind of international relations 101 is internal and external balancing. And so I think India knows what it has to do. Externally, the challenge is how do you make up most of what you've lost with the Americans and with whom? And that's a challenge because it's very difficult to replace the United States. But India has to work out, with its chosen set of partners, with the Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Middle Eastern, Israel, bit of Southeast Asia. What more can you do with these countries that will mean that you compensate to some degree with the challenges you're having with your American friends until such point, you hope, as the Americans come back a little bit closer to their, reversion to the mean, even if not the status quo ante. Yeah. And then, but the bigger question, I think, in the long term, again, think of Paul Kennedy and the rise and fall of the great powers. Ultimately, everything comes down to economic vitality. And I think that's the challenge. India, in that respect, is going through quite a positive moment. You've had 2 quarters of 8% growth, and people are quite excited about the Indian economic model. But ultimately, the only way that India can compete with China, principally in the long term, and become move from being what Mr. Jayashankar calls a leading power to becoming a great power by, let's say, roughly mid-century, is by continuing to develop economically and therefore militarily. And the big strategic challenge for India is that although China is growing at half the pace of India, it's that much bigger and its military is that much stronger that relatively India is falling behind. And so, if India wants to become a stronger country, it needs to find the way to continue its domestic economic reforms, because without that, then, that's the major challenge. But I think, in a sense, in both of these areas, there is a clear strategy that could be followed. The question then is the politics of can you deliver this given the barriers that you face? I think there are plenty of people in Delhi who know the path that needs to be taken, both in terms of internal reforms and external relationship building. The question is, can you do it?
Yeah. Well, that was fantastic. I mean, we are living through a very interconnected, interdependent, and also fragmented world. I think geopolitics and geoeconomics are now sitting on top of each other. And so every decision is as political as it is economic and technological, not to talk of that. But I think we've covered a fair amount of ground in this short time. Thank you so much for once again coming to the studio and for your time. And you're one of those few British origin journalists who have spent so much time looking, studying, talking to Indians. So it's we still have that love affair.
You're very kind.
So thank you so much, and wish you a great trip back here. And I hope you will continue to advocate closer ties and better understanding of India outside of the shores of India and Europe and elsewhere. Thank you so much, James, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. So, dear listeners, thank you very much for joining us for this show with Mr. James Crabtree of the European Council for Foreign Relations, a very well-known, illustrious writer, thinker, and columnist. We will bring you more in our future episodes. Till then, stay tuned, and thank you very much for joining us this time. Namaskar.